Thanks very much for the introduction. I'll get right to it, given the time. So critical social justice and the postmodern philosophy underlying it recently broke the boundaries of academia and gained great cultural power in Western society. The identitarian symptoms of postmodernism are easily recognisable, but the ethos underlying it is generally poorly understood. This set of ideas, while not new, has taken an applied turn and has entered the mainstream, significantly influencing thought, culture, policy and practice in global health. And maybe that's a misconception so far, that these ideas are just limited to the universities, because they are very much influencing institutions, and I include in those global health institutions. A related phenomenon, positionality statements, are becoming increasingly popular and called for in medicine, public health and global health, and not just in qualitative research. So I present a few examples of this trend and discuss the case for and against positionality statements in research. So the presentation is pretty much around two papers that I co-authored, which are considered rare published critiques of both trends. So part one is about critical social justice, and which pretty much manifests as decolonising global health, and part two is positionality statements. They're both related phenomena because they both are influenced by postmodern thought and identitarian leftist politics. They both pertain to research and academia. They both affect medicine and public health, and these are the underlying sciences and disciplines that feed into global health, humanitarian assistance, international development, as well as philanthropy and charity, and they've both accelerated in recent years. So, decolonising global health. First, to define global health, because a lot of people don't really know what it is. It's an endeavour that aims at the worldwide improvement of health. And global health institutions are the entities primarily concerned with advancing this aim. So it's a very, very broad field. Like you can imagine, the science, the institutions and the actors involved in global health are very, very broad. It's kind of like, I suppose, an analogy might be the field of poverty alleviation. So it's not just one thing. Calls to decolonise global health have intensified in recent years, as reflected in the rapid growth of the academic literature on this concept. Drawing from critical race theory and related analysis of structural racism and post-colonial theory. The literature essentially calls attention to asymmetries in the distribution of epistemic authority and decision-making power in global health, arguing that these have their origins in colonialism. And allegedly, this continues to disadvantage advantage and empower some persons over others, depending on their race, ethnicity and place of origin. So how to define decolonise global health? Definitions of decolonised global health are very conflicted, and there's no consensus. They include various perspectives: the historical perspective, which is the legacy of colonialism; the power perspective, the redistribution of power to the colonised or the oppressed; the epistemic perspective, which is about recognising and valuing Indigenous knowledge systems. A structural element, it's about restructuring global health institutions, funding mechanisms and partnerships, because they're seen to be disproportionately based in the global north. And there's an ethical perspective, ethical frameworks that prioritise justice. So I think this is an important point, that on one hand, some elements of the decolonised global health movement call attention to real problems and advocate for what we would already describe as good practice, such as valuing the perspectives of local people. On the other hand, they're essentially problematising and simplifying a complex reality. Ironically, the decolonised global health movement also often problematises itself, saying either that A, decolonisation has been co-opted by the powerful to maintain unequal power systems, B, by saying it is not going far enough, or that decolonisation is impossible. This image was actually published in a very prominent global health journal, PLOS Med, and the caption reads, "Global health, as currently practiced, has many asymmetries in power and privilege. Coloniality is but one manifestation of supremacy. Therefore, undoing supremacy will require much more than decolonisation." So that's the vagueness that we were talking about this morning. But we actually took the time to catalogue 50 of these articles and reports and analyse them using thematic analysis to kind of uncover similarities or thematic kind of patterns in these papers. So global health literature was literally flooded with decolonisation papers from about 2020. A recent scoping review found over 2,000 articles from 1994 to 22. And the reports included a glossary of new terminology, including structural racism, white gaze, white saviour, white supremacy, intersectionality, whiteness, microaggressions, lived experience. Here's the famous Lancet cover. Historically, the anatomy and physiology of bodies with vaginas have been neglected. A cover that totally devastated all the midwifery scholars that I know. So it was just flooded with this type of literature. So what does decolonisation mean in practice? So there's a range of different arguments about the best methods for addressing these asymmetries that have been identified. Authors affiliated to the global health decolonisation movement in Africa argue for reforms that are discrete, tangible and measurable. Others make the case for deeper, more systemic and ambiguous approaches to reform, including, in the case of this article, the complete overhaul of global health, removal of the coloniser from the discipline. The author doesn't explain what she means by this, but in other decolonise global health webinars, there were strong calls for high-income countries not to intervene at all in low-income countries during disasters or to withdraw assistance. So this does provide a good rationale to divest in global health, international development and humanitarian assistance. These are fields that are already significantly underfunded. So in terms of actions, the body of work calls for radical reimagining and usually stops there. Advocates for action, including acknowledging public acknowledgement of racism, shifting power, stopping the white gaze and white saviorism, and it problematises pragmatism. So there's kind of this insatiable quality to it where no action is enough. There's also a tendency to despair at the futility of action and engage in a form of nihilism. And just to give an example of that, another quote from some prominent scholars of global health. Even if decolonisation was possible, global health will likely not survive its decolonisation, and that might not be a bad outcome. Yet there was no suggestion for what might replace global health. So this is the first paper that I published called Powerful Ideas, and it's a critique of the decolonised global health movement based on these 50 articles that we identified and analysed. So despite the differences in the definitions and the ideas about applied decolonisation, there were 3 analytical tendencies that are common across this literature. First, knowledge, the argument that global health favours Western forms of knowledge and marginalises others. Second, universalism, the argument that global health is defined by a Eurocentric conception of humanity, which is incomplete and unjust. And purpose, the argument that the purportedly colonial origins of global health are retained in the contemporary structures and practices in the field. So I will explain these arguments and our responses to them in the following slides. So first, knowledge. So there are essentially 2 claims. The first claim is that local expertise in the global south, which is low and middle income countries, not necessarily geographical, but there's some overlap. So developing countries are generally referred to as the global south and high income countries are usually referred to as the global north. So local expertise in the global south is often undervalued in global health decision making, despite its potential to provide valuable insights when combined with expertise, which might be international or national. And this marginalisation reduces the effectiveness of this discipline. So this image is from one decolonised global health paper, and the caption reads, "If the world were mapped according to how many scientific research papers each country produced, it would take on a rather bizarre, uneven appearance where the Northern Hemisphere would balloon and the global south would effectively melt off the map." So there are complex reasons for why this is the case, which are not easily overcome. But often with critical social justice analysis, they conflate disparity with inequity. But at the same time, we can't deny that there is a kernel of truth in this. And this is why it gains popular support. It's not that people are idiots. There is a kernel of truth. And because the decolonised global health does draw attention to real problems, these disparities do exist. But the analysis of the root causes of these issues using solely a power lens and how to address them is where the decolonised global health analysis goes wrong and has the potential to do harm. Second, I didn't go to the second point actually on knowledge. So that's the kernel of truth, but the second claim is more contentious, and it's about the debate on different ways of knowing, which was touched on earlier today. So this argument claims that there's distinct forms of knowledge that exist for oppressors, the Westerners, and the oppressed. Decolonised global health claim that prioritising research-based knowledge over lived experience perpetuates this injustice. This view sometimes leads to questioning the legitimacy of entire scientific fields, including epidemiology. So obviously this discounts the contribution of scientists from all over the world to public health and global health knowledge, and we argue in our paper that dismissing scientific knowledge and technical expertise can undermine global health goals, and it can support science denial and political opportunism. And this has been evident in the misuse of decolonisation rhetoric in the past, for example, in South Africa, where there was HIV/AIDS denialism, and during the COVID-19 pandemic to divert criticism and endorse ineffective but expedient policies. So the second argument by the decolonisers is a critique of universalism. So they argue that universalism is a Western concept that serves to maintain unfair power differentials, and they see intergroup and international relationships as inherently adversarial. They categorise people into oppressed and oppressors based on identity aspects like race and ethnicity, while often ignoring other differences like age, income or class. And they also argue that they kind of problematise the concept of humanity itself. So the concept of humanity is apparently inherently linked to Eurocentric ideas, and that decolonisation requires the dismantling of this concept. So this is an example that was published in the British Medical Journal of Global Health. Humanity itself is argued to be problematic because it is inextricably linked to the Eurocentric conception of the human. Decolonisation has to begin with a deconstruction and dismantling of the concept of humanity as currently conceived, the uncoupling of man from human, and the unsettling of the hegemonic Western universalist conception of human, which normalises and overrepresents the Western bourgeois man. So that's pretty terrifying. So our response to this is that these critiques clash with the universal ideal that all persons deserve equal moral consideration, and this underpins global health and humanitarian principles, such as the commitment to assist all people in distress based on need and regardless of their identity. And it's probably like universalism, which is a focus on our common humanity, calls for strengthening of intergroup and international solidarity by appealing to human empathy, solidarity and fairness. So it's probably something that maybe hasn't been noted today is that the worldviews of critical social justice and liberal social justice aren't just different, they're actually inherently opposed and arguably cannot coexist. So one strategy of critical social justice is to conflate it itself with social justice, where it's just one approach to social justice, and liberal social justice being the other. So thirdly, purpose. The argument of the decolonisers here is that global health often fails to meet its ideals and commitments. Again, this is the kernel of truth. An example in the COVID-19 vaccine distribution, young, healthy individuals in wealthy countries were prioritised and vulnerable populations in poorer regions missed out. So there are, again, complex reasons for this that are not easily overcome. And the decolonisers go on to argue that causes of these failures are due to our colonial roots. global health mainly being based in the global north is interpreted to mean that their efforts work to preserve power and privilege in the global north. So you can just see from these three images here, this is like the evolution of global health. It started as tropical medicine, which was arguably the protection of colonial representatives from tropical diseases, and then it moved into like international health, which was more bilateral, high-income countries assisting low-income countries, and Global Health 3.0 is the collective action to address shared risks and responsibilities. So we argue in our article that misdiagnosing the causes of our recognised failures, such as attributing them solely to colonial legacies, can lead to ineffective solutions because you have the wrong diagnosis, or inaction because you kind of despair in the futility of undoing history, which is not possible. So recognising historical influence is important, but current problems are not all due to our history, and this can overlook more proximal and addressable causes. So just a quote from our paper, because there was kind of this other tendency to deny all progress. This evolution of global health, for example, was argued by the decolonisers to be perpetuating unfair power systems, whereas we wrote in our paper, it is not self-evident that the evolution of the global health mission from supporting colonialism to supporting health and reducing health disparities is best understood in terms of strategic confusion. It might instead be taken as evidence of progress. So just to summarise these three analytical tendencies in the decolonised global health literature: knowledge. The decolonisers would argue that global health favours Western forms of knowledge, and we argue that this has the potential to undermine confidence in scientific knowledge, and it also opens the door to political opportunism, and it supports deep divestment in global health, which is really what we don't need right now. Universalism. Decolonisers argue that global health is defined by a Eurocentric conception of humanity, which is incomplete and unjust, but without offering an alternative. And we argue that undermining universalism works to accentuate intergroup and international antagonisms. And finally, purpose. The decolonisers argue that the colonial origins of global health are retained, and we argue that this discounts the degree of progress already achieved and may also curtail opportunities for progress in the future. So just to demonstrate how this is applied and entered the mainstream, this is a case study of decolonising philanthropy. I would say that global health, international development and humanitarian assistance are uniquely vulnerable to these ideas because they are largely made up of progressive thinkers who hold themselves to high moral standards. They often have a culture of introspection and self-critique, and they're historically prone to criticism, also by the right, that we shouldn't be interfering or investing outside our own borders. So this is where the left meets the right. So here is a case study of a philanthropic organisation imploding under the influence of these powerful ideas. And this is a quote from the CEO that was made public in 2023. Philanthropy is a function of colonial capitalism. It has been shaped by it, is being driven by it, and yet philosophically it tries to position itself as somehow a cure for the ills of colonial capitalism, and that contradiction needs to stop. So Lankelly Chase is dismantling itself to avoid perpetuating colonial capitalism. The foundation asserts that closing down is necessary for a radical reimagining and a departure from the dominant model of philanthropy. This trend reflects a broader pattern in the decolonisation movement, where there are calls to disrupt, defund and dismantle charitable organisations perceived to be structurally racist, colonialist and aligned with white supremacy. And this is even though Lankelly Chase is an organisation that for 60 years has been dedicated to social justice and economic equality. So the charges are that philanthropy wrongly focuses on immediate social needs while failing to address underlying systemic issues or challenging power dynamics. So we argue that contemporary philanthropy often focuses on systemic issues like poverty, education and healthcare, and some organisations do need to focus on immediate needs like Médecins Sans Frontières, for example, because we can't all focus on systemic needs or prevention. The world does need an emergency department. We argue that it is not clear that by dismantling philanthropy and closing up charitable foundations, these systemic issues will be better addressed. On the contrary, this action is likely to harm the people and communities that charitable foundations serve in the short term with no long-term benefits. So in the Lang-Kelly-Chase example, only ideological goals are cited for the shutdown, and no claim is made that by abolishing the organisation, the people that previously benefited will be helped. The second argument is around philanthropy, is that philanthropy is rooted in wealth unjustly amassed through colonial capitalism. So while it's difficult or impossible to separate any wealth from history or economic systems, because all money is dirty at some stage, philanthropy aims to have a potential positive impact regardless of its origin. So it could be seen as a form of reparations. That's what we argue. And thirdly, the decolonisers argue that philanthropy is used as a tool for reputation management. And this is related to similar critiques about white saviorism in humanitarian assistance and the popularity of the hashtag #CharitySoWhite. We argue while people and organisations are concerned with their reputations, they can also still genuinely want to do good for others. And virtue ethicists would argue we need to practice doing good things so that we'll eventually like doing them. And if reputational concern nudges people to help others that they wouldn't otherwise help, then we would argue that's a good thing. So in short, when charitable organisations are threatened, weakened or dismantled, the impact on disadvantaged people is likely to worsen, hence the title of my article in Discourse, Conscience over Consequences. And this is also linked to the idea that critical social justice ideas are elite ideas because they favour the people who have them and they disadvantage the people who are supposed to be helped by them. So I just have a few more slides on positionality statements, not as long as the former piece. So a positionality statement, also known as a reflexivity statement, is a description of an author's identity as it relates to a research topic. It's related to diversity statements and previously faith statements in religious institutions that candidates used to have to sign to say they agree with creationism, for example, but now they're very much an issue in research. So in response to that Powerful Ideas article, we received a lot of ad hominem criticism from prominent scholars online, and they urged us to reflect on our positionality. So that gave us the idea for our next paper, which probably wasn't exactly what they expected. And the paper's called Positionality and Its Problems, Questioning the Value of Reflexivity Statements in Research. So if I was to steel man positionality statements, they're meant to acknowledge that all research contributions are carried out by subjective humans whose backgrounds give them a particular lens through which to see the world. The purpose of a positionality statement is to highlight the researcher's cognitive limits and opportunities so that the readers are aware of how those factors may have influenced observations and interpretations. But they're moving from ethnography and qualitative research in social sciences to the natural and health sciences, psychology, even engineering and other fields. So in short, positionality statements are on the rise. Our objections are threefold, and I wrote this paper with 2 philosophers and a sociologist. That positionality statements are impossible, unnecessary and potentially harmful, and I'll explain briefly what I mean in the following slides. First, a couple of examples of positionality statements. So this was published in the American Sociological Review in 2019. Both authors are middle and upper middle class white women. One is a mother, the other is not. A commitment to anti-racist, intersectional and feminist principles guides our research efforts, and we conducted this work with an awareness of the politics, dangers and limitations of affluent white academics, writing about the lives of low-income black Americans. A second example from physics education. I identify as a white, cisgender, heterosexual, continuing generation man with a colourblind deficiency. I was raised in a pair of low-income households, but I now earn an upper middle class income. My experiences working with marginalised students, particularly those whom I have had the honour to mentor as researchers, have motivated my attempts to use my position and privilege to dismantle oppressive power structures. As someone who seeks to be an ally, it is easy to overlook my own privileges. I try to broaden my perspective through feedback from those with more diverse lived experiences than my own. Apart from the claim that one person could have a more diverse lived experience than another person, I don't really know where to start with that. But again, to try to understand where this is coming from, the rationale for positionality statements is that as humans, all scholars are products of their environment, and this fact generates subjective and cultural bias in our work. So rather than pretend that they are objective observers, it is better to make it clear that the readers understand who they are and where they're coming from. This is what their argument is anyway. So on the surface, it might be a defensible position, but like so often when postmodernism is applied, the theory doesn't translate to life very well. And I've just got a few more slides now. So first, impossible, the limits of reflexivity. Like a scale that tries to weigh itself, constructing a credible positionality statement is ultimately an impossible task. So it's an impossible task because positionality statements is difficult as researchers' social position is inevitably influenced. The social position inevitably influences how they write these statements, so true objectivity is impossible. The emphasis on listing personal attributes may not be particularly relevant to any given study, so there's kind of this selective disclosure effect. Scholars face a dilemma in claiming their biographies influence their research while simultaneously believing that they overcome these biases using their positionality statements. So in other words, you can't really escape your own biography no matter how aware of it you are. That's why they're impossible. They're also unnecessary. They're barking up the wrong tree. Positionality statements miss the mark because the advancement of scholarship, a fundamentally collective enterprise, does not depend on the biographical characteristics of individual participants. Thank goodness. The advancement of scholarship relies on intersubjective competition where participants, biased by their personal interest, engage in a collective process governed by scientific norms to minimise the influence of personal factors. There's other features as well of science that limit bias, such as blind peer review, reproducibility, data sharing, and methodological innovation. So positionality statements are unnecessary. There's also no evidence at all that they're effective in what they aim to achieve, so they're not evidence-based practice, which is kind of a conundrum as to why so many journals are now requiring them. And thirdly, there's a potential for harm. So by disclosing personal characteristics, positionality statements violate the scientific norm of universalism, which dictates that scholarship should be judged on its merits. As Jonathan Rausch writes, no one has personal authority, so independent of the author's identity. Including positionality statements can create bias in the peer review process. Recently, a colleague of mine was asked by a peer reviewer, so even though the journal didn't require a positionality statement, sometimes they're optional, sometimes they're required, what her racial identity was and how she thought it was appropriate that she was doing research with people in impoverished people in Bangladesh. That was a question from a peer reviewer. So it does influence which manuscripts are reviewed and how they're evaluated, whether we like it or not. Positionality statements also incentivise authors to present themselves in ways that increase their chances of success, and this can lead to exaggeration or fabrication of personal characteristics. So the total impact of positionality statements is likely on the scholarly process is likely to be negative, and this quote is from our paper. A mature discipline recognises that whatever progress it has made towards a more perfect knowledge, it has done so as a result of a time-consuming collective process during which multiple participants with conflicting viewpoints present ideas, scrutinise data, challenge results, refute hypotheses, and build on each other's contributions. So, in summary, decolonised global health and positionality statements are both postmodern trends that have gained great popularity in recent years, mostly without being challenged. They myopically use power as a single lens through which to analyse our problems. They lean into identity politics and often misdiagnose the complex causes of our problems, leading to false solutions or inaction. And they have the potential to subvert the fragile principles, norms and values upon which global health, international development and humanitarian assistance rely. Thanks very much.
This was very clear. Thank you very much. Great talk. So just questions here. Start with you. It's on.
I have a very...
It's on? Yes, it's on.
Okay, I have a very short question. What is the foreign gaze that appears on that elephant image?
The foreign gaze. Oh, it's like the white gaze. So it's the way white or foreign people view problems in the global south. There's a whole paper on the foreign gaze, which was written by the editor of...
I found the paper. I quickly looked at it, but then the explanation was like they couldn't consider it.
Yeah, it's a very long postmodern explanation, but a lot of... So there's very prominent scholars in global health that are leading this conversation and unopposed, and some of them are editors of global health journals, and there's one journal in particular that is totally postmodern. Everything it produces. So if you want a steady stream of evidence of this, it's absolutely available. Corey?
Yeah, I was wondering if anybody has, or if not, whether you would consider like following up on the groups that some of these philanthropy organizations were helping to see if the divestment has positive or negative outcomes. I mean, they wouldn't accept it, I guess, because that's science, but it seems you could take these opportunities to study experimentally whether, you know, decolonization causes good things or bad things.
Yeah, that would be great, and I would like to take a leaf out of your book and look at the empirical questions around this so that we can come back with evidence, and I think we have to really give some careful strategic thought as to what those questions would be. But I think that would be a long process with Kelly Chase, for example, and they're still in the process of radical reimagining. They're also recruiting somebody to help them with that process. So,
an expert radical reimaginer.
Yes, I wouldn't want that job, but yeah, it's a good question. I would like to think carefully about what those questions would be. Also, I think mapping this evidence would be useful, and doing a more systematic analysis of this literature, just to show the scale and the common themes, because we just took 50 papers, but there's thousands of papers.
On the statement that people say, okay, I am the son of a rich people, and I'm sorry. If you look at the demography of that, because what strikes me is that the young generation is very individualistic. She wants me, myself, and I. There's a lot. So, oh yes, I want to do this, and I'm sorry. They think about themselves. So they say, oh yes, I would like to tell you from where I come. I say, I don't care. I look at your paper and I look at the data. For them, they don't understand that. As you said at the end, you evaluate the data, not the person. Yeah. For them, no, you have to take into account the person. So I think the age, there can be a demographic effect of a young generation below 30, 35.
Yeah, it would be interesting to do an analysis on the positionality statements, also in terms of which journals require them, which journals don't require them but consider them, and then what is actually in these, and also where are they coming from, because my impression is that they are very much coming from where critical social justice is very prevalent in institutions. Like, I don't see any authors from the Global South writing these positionality statements. So it is kind of like, yeah, elite ideas once again, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what we have is in fact this standpoint epistemology. Yeah. It comes from the standpoint epistemology, and from, let's say, there were one thing that led me to Michel Foucault. He asked his students, from where you are speaking,
No.
which point you are speaking.
No, in fact, in Foucault, it's very interesting to know that if you read his book, in the first, they really show that in le savoir, he says, ne me demandez pas qui je suis, ni d'où je parle, ceci est une morale d'état civil. That's the sentence I quote every time on. He says, do not ask me who I am and where I speak. This is a morality of civil state. So I use that sentence against those who misunderstand Foucault. We can be against Foucault, but at some point they don't understand Foucault. Those don't understand Bourdieu. They say, oh, dominant, dominated. Come on, Bourdieu is not limited to dominant and dominated. I'm sorry, but I work with him, so I know. But those people think they are Foucauldian. I said, yeah, but read this. He says clearly, because he changed a lot, Foucault.
He changed because
he says, don't ask me why I say this now, why I changed now, and I work on this. So they use words like Foucault at the end.
But I think the other important distinction is that these are interesting intellectual ideas. Like standpoint epistemology is like considered reputable by philosophers anyway. The problem is when this becomes like a paradigm that everybody uses it as a conceptual framework to understand complex issues, and then when it moves to a regime where it's applied, that's where it needs to be opposed. It's still interesting intellectual ideas, but as you can see in practice, it can do more harm than good.